Well, good evening. I'm Jim Simpson, Executive Director at the Center on Faith and Justice. And on behalf of the Center and alongside our partners, Interfaith Alliance, Sojourners, the Horizons Project, and many, many more, welcome. We had over 800 people register for tonight, and that includes people from 48 different states. And so I'll just note that it looks like we've got a little bit of work to do in Arkansas and Mississippi, but that's maybe work we can pick up in the days and weeks to come. Thank you for being a part of this important first step and what we hope will grow into a broad, interconnected movement of people of faith and conscience committed to nonviolent civil resistance in defense of democracy. We're gathering tonight because we recognize the urgency of this moment. Authoritarianism doesn't arrive all at once. It erodes our norms, divides our communities, and weakens our moral resolve. And yet, history shows that organized, disciplined, faith-rooted nonviolence can help to turn the tide. Tonight is about beginning that work together. You'll hear from experienced organizers and faith leaders who've been at the forefront of nonviolent movements, and we'll share how you can begin connecting with others in your local area. A few quick logistics before we begin. Later on in the webinar, we'll have time for questions, so please submit any questions you have by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you can't find that, you can also add questions into the chat function, and we will pick those up hopefully as we go along. So we'll have time for questions later. We'll follow up afterwards with links to key resources, readings, and next steps for getting involved. And finally, and most importantly, the one question that comes up on every webinar, the slides and a recording of this webinar will be made available afterwards. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I have the privilege now of turning to the Reverend Jim Wallace to offer some opening remarks.
Well, I am so pleased that so many of you have turned up for this. It's just extraordinary. And I want each of you to understand that the role you can play in your states and cities all around the country is crucial in what is indeed a historical moment. We have quite remarkable trainers and organizers, resource people on this call who know all the history of nonviolent direct action, nonviolent civil resistance. But we now are at a time where we need to make some new history. Based on all the history that we know, and we'll share tonight, some new history now is there for the making. We're coming off a weekend where we saw so many people, 7 million, according to the organizers, turn out for No King's Day. And it was the street corners in my neighborhood, not just the mall downtown. And as deeply encouraged I was by watching all that, and so impressed that in all the circumstances and situations that all those protesters were in, there was not a single act that I've seen of violence or conflict. That's remarkable. So historically, it's worth noting that when 7 million people act and follow a discipline of nonviolence, that's quite something to see and build on. Tonight's time to build on that, because you know what? Protest isn't going to be enough. As deeply encouraged I am by the protest by itself won't be enough. How do we go deeper? How do we move into non-cooperation? How do we move into nonviolent civil resistance? How do we move? We're not going to be happy with just big demonstrations every few months. It's got to be weekly, it's got to be daily, and it's got to be local in all our communities across this country. And you represent all those places. So for me to have the blessing, that's how it feels to me, to have the blessing of these amazing organizers on this call, mobilizers, faith leaders, tremendous resource. but to have you all in your places, your contexts, your cities and states, small towns, big cities, that's crucial to take a next step. So let's take the history that we love and have been shaped by, the nonviolent history, particularly in civil rights movement, the Black churches. But how do we take that history and make a new history right now? We need nothing less than a new history that goes beyond protest, goes deeper than protest, but goes to nonviolent direct action and civil resistance. So it's always good to begin something like this with a prayer. So one of my favorite faith leaders that I knew when he was a very young man, he's still a young man, but he's deeply a man of faith, and he's a good prayer. So Rabbi Jonah Pesner, good to see you, my brother, and please speak to us.
I love you, Jim Wallace, and everybody. We have nearly 500 people on this Zoom representing thousands of others who all love you and appreciate you, and Jim Simpson as well, and the other faith leaders, friends. I echo Jim's reflection on history, and as a Jewish person, reaching out to my interfaith family on this Zoom, we have Christian leaders, we have people calling in who are of the Muslim and Hindu and Baha'i and all faiths and all kinds of spiritualities together, unified, knowing that democracy is not just what keeps us safe, but what enables us to thrive. So, Jim Wallace, you have to give me the liberty to say this very clearly as a Jewish leader. Anti-Semitism, the hatred of Jews, is real. There is a violence and a fear. That is true, but it is also true that some of our illiberal authoritarian leaders, in their impulses to cling and claim power, are using the fear that Jews feel to degrade democratic norms, to destroy democratic institutions in the name of keeping Jews safe, which is blasphemy. I'll name it for what it is. We first understood in 1790 when George Washington met with the leaders of the Jewish community of Rhode Island, who were afraid then. We learned from him that what keeps us safe, us minorities, religious minorities, Muslim, Baha'i, Hindu, Sikh, all of us, safe is democracy. I read you these words from George Washington, who was reassuring a frightened Jewish community 200 years ago, 250 almost. The citizens of the United States of America, he said, have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizen. All of us. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that enjoy the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it all on all occasions, their effectual support. And I know, friends, at the time that George Washington said these words, there were some who were enslaved, the descendants of African kidnapping and enslavement. There were Native Americans whose land had been stolen. There were women who were disenfranchised. However imperfect the democracy of 1790 was, there was a vision of the possibility that it would be democracy that would give rights to all people, regardless of who they were or where they came from or to what expression of God they prayed. And so I opened with this prayer, echoing George Washington. Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu, God who is the God of our ancestors, the God who spoke to us in the words of Muhammad and Moses and Abraham and Jesus and Mary and so many others across time. God, speak to us now, so that as George Washington echoed in your biblical revelation, that we all could dwell in this land and merit and enjoy the goodwill of all inhabitants, while every person can sit safely under their own vine and fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. May we live in the multiracial inclusive democracy that keeps all of us safe and enables all of us to thrive. And now it's my honor to pass it to my colleague, Reverend Carlos Malave, to continue to pray us in and lead us onward.
Good evening. I would like to, first of all, thank the Center on Faith and Justice and our friend both, Jim Wallace and Jim Simpson, and all the others who have made possible tonight training. Two things that I like to say, two things that we see on social media that I see all the time. One of them is the one that really breaks my heart, and that is the abuse and the persecution of this administration against Latinos in this country. And obviously what we are facing, it has to do with more than the Latino community or the immigrant community. But we have been chosen as scapegoats because of what I believe is even more, much more than prejudice, but it is racism itself. And so we see the abuse in social media with people who are recording all the time, all the abusive tactics of ICE. The other thing that I see all the time is the creative ways in which our community and other communities, it's not only our Latino community, other communities, creative ways in which they are resisting ICE. And we are using grassroots organizing to support each other. We are using what is called now smartphone journalism and to document events, and as I said before, the abuse of this administration and ICE against our people. And we are actively creating places where people can come and feel safe and working to create in the midst of the chaos neighborhoods that are safe neighborhoods. We are doing webinars. Our organization, LCNN, together with 3 or 4 other organizations, have been doing webinars since January, educating our people in all kind of ways, spiritually, legally, how to come together as a community, supporting people in their emotional and spiritual crisis that they're having. And so our community is stepping up to this moment. People like Pastor Carlos Rincon in Los Angeles, a Pentecostal Assemblies of God pastor, who have placed himself so many times in Los Angeles in harm's way to be between ICE agents and the community. He was, at least in one occasion, he was in the middle of gunfire, rubber bullets, but nonetheless, those rubber bullets hit him and hit him very, very hard, and many other people who were with him. He was there praying in the middle of this kind of almost like a war in Los Angeles. So pastors like him all throughout the country are stepping up. People in places like Chicago, as we have seen, using creative ways to go after ICE automobiles and whatever they use, and honking several cars around them, honking their cars and letting people know that ICE is in the community. Some places like Los Angeles, dozens and dozens of cars come and surround and even have stopped traffic in streets, surround the ICE cars. So our community, together and supported by other communities, are doing whatever they can. I understand that often we feel paralyzed, and so often we feel like we don't have power, but that's not true. The reality is that the power resides in the people, and we together must find all creative ways under the law to resist this evil movement that's taken over our country. So thank you to all of you who are working together, at least in what it has to do with the immigration crisis that we have. I know, again, it's more than the immigration crisis, but together we will face this moment. And now I'll pass the mic to my dear friend, Adam Taylor, president of Sojourners.
My name is Reverend Adam Russell Taylor, and I have the honor of leading Sojourners. And while I regret that I'm not able to be with you because of another commitment tonight, I'm so grateful that we are one of the co-conveners of this civil resistance preview and training. We are proud to come alongside all of the other co-sponsors because we recognize that this is a moment that demands greater courage. It demands that we tap in to the very best of our faith. Sojourners has been working throughout our history to ensure that Christians are equipped and inspired to be on the front lines of defending human dignity. And that increasingly requires that we also defend and strengthen our very democratic system and norms, which are increasingly under assault. We work with other leaders and organizations from across other faith traditions in order to build the kind of multi-faith, multiracial movement that is desperately needed in this moment. We are living in trying and troubling times in which we are seeing the consolidation of power and a slide into authoritarianism right before our very eyes. So often, tragically, faith and the abuse of faith has so often fueled and supercharged authoritarian power grabs in many parts of the world, including what's happening in the United States right now. This is connected in our context to the rise of an ideology that many of us refer to as Christian nationalism that has been undergirding the current slide toward authoritarianism. But we also believe that our faith communities can and must serve as the critical countervailing force to defend our basic freedoms and to save and strengthen our very democratic system itself. At the core of our Judeo-Christian tradition is the foundational belief in Imago Dei, that we are indeed made in the very image and likeness of God. And while no political system is perfect, certainly ours has been far from that, we believe that a strengthened, renewed, just, and inclusive democracy is the best pathway that we can fulfill the biblical call to affirm the human dignity of everyone, to protect the most vulnerable and achieve thriving for all. But authoritarianism does the exact opposite. It concentrates and enables the abuse of power. In fact, it is a form of idolatry because it undermines our primary devotion to God and replaces it with a pursuit of power over the common good. We know that our faith traditions are steeped in resistance. In fact, the Bible itself is in many ways a handbook that shows us how to resist and overcome oppression. And so we believe this is a time where we have to dig into that deep well of our faith. I'm so grateful for all the ways that faith communities have already been showing up. From mutual aid to organizing vigils and protests to protecting those people who have been most targeted by the Trump administration. From immigrants to LGBTQ folks to people facing increasing hardship, including in the midst of this now 3-week government shutdown. In addition to these efforts, we also need to learn and strengthen new wineskins to meet the crisis that we are facing now. Protest, advocacy, and voting will remain essential, but we also need to dig deeper in our understanding and commitment to civil nonviolent resistance as an absolutely essential way that we prevent and reverse the slide into greater authoritarianism. And so tonight we will learn from past movements, including our own civil rights struggle. We also learn from faith-inspired movements in places like Brazil, Poland, the Philippines, and so many other countries. where faith has played a decisive role in helping to defeat and in many cases replace authoritarian regimes. So I'm just prayerful and hopeful that tonight will inspire and convict all of you to join with us to help mobilize our faith in ways that inspire greater degrees of courage, so that together we can meet this moment and ultimately overcome it with our faith.
Okay, all right. Hi, everyone. I think we're making our way back here. Technical difficulties happen, especially in moments like these, but it's really wonderful to be with you all. Thank you for tuning in all across the country. My name is Maria Steffen. I'm the co-lead of the Horizons Project, which is an organizing platform that's focused on building the biggest and broadest and most powerful front to confront authoritarianism and build a powerful multiracial democracy in the US, and have done a lot of work, research, and working with groups around the world who have challenged authoritarianism in its various facets. So, and just to say, Reverend Jim Wallace talked about how remarkable the No Kings national rallies were this past weekend. And just to put a historic point on it, we just experienced, and I imagine many people on this call were part of No Kings demonstrations in your part of the country. This was the largest single day protest in US history. That is amazing. And the reach was profound. It was not just the big cities, it was the rural areas, conservative, liberal, very diverse parts of the country were actively involved. And, I think one of the reasons why we saw such profound discipline, there was so much joy, there was so much humor, there was so much humanity. I think faith communities have played a pretty important part in that. When all the faith communities that I know in New York and other places, they were providing a moral leadership. They were organizing and mobilizing their congregations. They were leading trainings. They were singing to keep people morale high, to keep people hopeful, inspired. They were being peacekeepers. So thank you to all the people of faith and faith communities who helped make that a truly remarkable day. And as we know, we need to sustain that mobilization. We need to sustain that pressure. We need to engage in different forms of nonviolent action and nonviolent resistance in this moment. And, hearing from Reverend Carlos just now, just about all the ways that faith leaders are placing themselves in harm's way. And I'm thinking also about the pastor from Broadview, Illinois, who was also recently shot in the head while praying and while protesting outside of an ICE detention facility. I'm thinking about the large interfaith mobilization that's happening in my city, New York City, tonight, to protest the intensification of ICE activities and to push back against the potential deployment of the National Guard. I'm thinking about so many acts of pastoral care and solidarity that are happening across the country. And it just reminds me in this moment of how important and powerful the moral courage, the creativity, and the organizing power that faith communities are bringing to our beautiful struggle for freedom, truth, and democracy. So thank you for everyone that is involved in all your different ways on this call tonight. So I've been asked to provide some context, some grounding in the moment that we're living in, now in the United States. So I'll ask Andrea to switch to the next slide. All of these faithful actions we've already started the call talking about are urgent and necessary in a context of rapidly consolidating authoritarianism that it's happening in the United States. And so, in talking about authoritarianism, we know that today, the way that democracies are dying is not necessarily due to abrupt overthrows or violent coups. Rather, it's the sort of death by a thousand cuts. It's when democratically elected leaders go on to subvert the norms and institutions of democracy. And the tricky thing is that they often do it legally, in the name of defending democracy. So it can be hard to miss what's going on beneath the surface. And so you see these gradual erosions of democracy that then can rapidly result in democratic losses. And I think this is what we're experiencing right now. Very important to note that authoritarianism is not an individual or a small group of people. It is a system. It is a system that is held up by organizations and institutions that provide it with the social, political, economic, financial, and moral, cultural support it needs to maintain power. And we're going to talk about these pillars of support tonight. And just to say, while there are unique things happening right now in terms of the speed with which autocracy is consolidating in the US, there is a long history of authoritarianism in this country, grounded in unbridled capitalism, economic inequality, in racism and racial hierarchies, and in religious nationalism. And we know from the rise of fascism in the 1930s, from the consolidation of Jim Crow racial authoritarianism in the South, that this is a long part of our history. And what we're experiencing now stems from those roots. And so this is also part of our history. The next slide, please. So the other thing, even though, what we're experiencing now in terms of the intensification of repression, the attacks on the rule of law, the aggrandizement of executive power, this is happening in a global context of rising authoritarianism. So for the past 20 years, we've seen rising autocracy and backsliding democracy all around the world. And not only that, autocrats are learning from each other. They're swapping notes. They're collaborating. And we know one of the most blatant examples of this was, the leaders of the January 6th attempted coup and insurrection in the United States were actively supporting a similar attempt in Brazil to overturn the results of the election in 2023 that Bolsonaro did not win. So there's very active collaboration that's happening between these autocrats. Next slide. And so, just to put a finer point on what we're experiencing, we are now in the midst of an authoritarian breakthrough. This is a window in which a would-be authoritarian regime attempts to quickly consolidate power, eliminate checks, and operate with impunity. And, scholars who look at countries around the world that have experienced backsliding democracies, their conclusion is that the rate with which authoritarianism is consolidating in the US is significantly faster than analogous countries like Hungary, like Brazil, like Turkey. So, if you feel like the repression and the retribution is happening quickly, it's because it is. So the next slide, please. So, the thing about autocrats is that they all basically follow the same playbook, whether they're left-wing dictators or right-wing authoritarian regimes. And their playbook is basically fear-based divide and rule. So, they're grounded in trying to pit people against each other, stifle dissent, get people to bend the knee and remain silent so that they can consolidate wealth and power. And they all use, basically the same set of tactics. So they direct investigations against critics. They weaponize the Department of Justice, the IRS, the FBI to investigate opponents, whether they're individuals like James Comey or Letitia James, law firms, universities, media outlets. They license lawbreaking. They pardon insurrectionists. They offer clemency to white-collar criminals, just to normalize, lawlessness and violence. They use regulatory retaliation against opponents. They threaten media outlets to pull licenses. When they disagree with free speech, something that we've seen recently with ABC, CBS, pressuring Disney to pull Jimmy Kimmel Live off the air over a speech that he used. And luckily in that case, we came together, we mobilized, we boycotted, and Jimmy Kimmel was put back on the air. But they use these various subtle forms of regulatory retaliation. Federal law enforcement overreach. So this is, immigration enforcement right now, ICE and all the federal agencies enforcing these heavy-handed policies. This is like the primary vector for authoritarianism right now. And what is it about? It's about terrorizing communities. It's about punishing dissent. It's about a show of force. So that is what is happening now. And then, the deployment of the military. We've seen, this Unbelievable deployment of National Guard, our men and women in uniform, to cities from Los Angeles to DC to Portland, Chicago, Memphis, now threatening deployments in San Francisco and LA, again, as like a show of force and to demonstrate control over the military and to use them for political means. And then, finally, the autocrat won't leave. Autocrats go after voting rights. They promote conspiracy theories about fraudulent elections. They orchestrate a fake national emergency over the election, something that the New York Times has exposed what is happening now with the administration. And then they try to stay in power even when they lose elections. And we've already experienced that once in this country, after the president lost the election in 2020 and attempted a coup. So that's what autocrats do. And learning these patterns allows us to figure out how to respond and empowers us to connect the dots and figure out how we can, collectively respond in this moment. So the next slide. Now, what is the role of religion in all of this? So we know that religion is powerful. Autocrats like to use religion to advance their aims. And we know that, they use religious symbols, slogans, sacred texts to justify their exclusionary repressive rule. They use traditional values that support hierarchy, patriarchy, traditional gender norms. And we know as well that LGBTQ and immigrant scapegoating are favored tactics of far-right autocrats around the world. They use anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic appeals to racial and religious purity in order to mobilize their base. So that's their game. Again, it's kind of the use of religion to divide and consolidate power. Next slide. And of course, in this country, Christian nationalism is providing ideological fuel and moral cover for authoritarianism. This Christian nationalism is fusing a very narrow, exclusionary vision of Christianity with the demand for political dominance. It frames the US as a divinely ordained country for white conservative Christians and casts pluralism, dissent, and secular institutions as threats to God's will. So then in this case, dismantling democratic norms and institutions, delegitimizing pluralism, multiracial democracy becomes not just a political choice, but a sacred duty. And that's what makes it so dangerous and why faithful rejection and non-cooperation with Christian nationalist claims and exhortations is so important. Next slide. But thanks be to God, populations in this country and around the world have confronted tyrants and repressive authoritarian regimes with moral courage and nonviolent resistance, and they have prevailed. Think about the US Civil Rights Movement, our greatest pro-democracy movement, which featured all types of nonviolent resistance, the lunch counter sit-ins, the consumer boycotts. This is an image in the top left of the Montgomery bus boycott, sustained over 381 days. To desegregate buses. So profound, faith organization, labor unions, students involved in that movement. The anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, again, with a united democratic front, faith leadership, unions engaging in boycotts, divestment to push back on the white apartheid regime and pave the way to a multiracial democracy. The movement in Chile that ousted Augusto Pinochet after years of repressive dictatorship. And after Pinochet attempted to overturn a plebiscite that he lost, it was miners and workers, faith leaders, students engaged in banging of pots and pans, non-compliance, security forces who refused to back him, all contributed to the democratic transition in that country. And then most recently, last year in South Korea, after the president imposed martial law, an emergency decree, the people rose up. It was kids with K-pop sticks. It was evangelical Buddhist leaders engaging in moral defiance. It was the Confederation of Trade Unions that said nope, and they stopped that emergency law and ended up impeaching their president. And I just put in the middle one of the most powerful resources that I found. It's an oldie but a goodie, but the documentary film A Force More Powerful, which chronicles the 6 major nonviolent struggles that have changed the course of human history. You can all access that free of charge online. So a powerful resource. Next slide. And so this is what really gives me hope that autocrats at the end of the day are often weaker than they appear, and we are stronger than we often think. And so, part of my work with Erica Chenoweth years ago involved studying hundreds of campaigns challenging autocracy globally. And, so these were everything from, the cases I mentioned, anti-apartheid, Chile, the movements in Latin America, Central Eastern Europe against communist dictatorship, a range of different types of movements. And, when we were studying these cases, we found that there were a few core attributes of successful movements. And this doesn't mean that there's a blueprint for success. And honestly, every day we're trying to figure out what is the right thing to do in this moment. But one thing that, the research and the evidence makes clear is that mass diverse participation in movements is really key to success. So, being able to amass a large diverse participation base makes a movement more representative. It gives it more power. Diverse movements are harder to repress. They generate more leverage, more power. They have more disruptive potential. So that being able to engage a broad, diverse front in a big tent is really, really important. And some of you may have heard of this statistic that no regime has remained in power when 3.5% of the population has engaged in active protest, and many authoritarian regimes have been removed with far less than 3.5%. So that's about 11 million Americans. And so, the work to mobilize, to organize that number, to maintain momentum in leadership is so key. Expanding the repertoire of tactics. We just came off of a massively powerful no-hands nationwide demonstrations. Hugely important to show solidarity, to show mass, that we're in it together. And we know that the power of nonviolent resistance comes from different tactics. It comes from the boycotts. It comes from the walkouts. It comes from the strikes. It comes from building alternative institutions and constructing the alternatives to be able to support communities who are facing repression and who are vulnerable. So that drawing on a large repertoire of tactics is so critically important. Being able to shift loyalties within key pillars. So these, when you start to see workers and union members, not cooperating and restricting their labor, when businesses start to speak out often out of business interests that, authoritarian practices are undermining an economic interest, business interests, when faith leaders start refusing to allow their religion to be used as a tool of authoritarianism, when security forces defy orders to repress peaceful protesters. All of this, when you start to see shifts in these key pillars, that's when you know that a movement is gaining power and strength. And then, sadly, authoritarian regimes often use various forms of repression, political violence, targeting of vulnerable communities. And so the movements that were able to plan for that, train, develop codes of conduct, and organize in ways that would make repression backfire, something that Reverend Naomi is going to be speaking to tonight. These were the movements that were able to sustain momentum and push back against authoritarian power. So next slide, please. So the bottom line there is that people power has prevailed repeatedly around the world. And, the other statistic, scholars who have looked particularly at democratic backsliding contexts have found that we need traditional institutional methods in this moment. We need the voting. We need the litigation. Thank God for the courts that are pushing back in this moment. We need the advocacy. But those institutional channels, while important, are insufficient at a moment where those institutions are often in the hands of hostile powers, of people who are trying to undermine democracy. So we need a civil resistance movement. We need extra institutional means to be able to amass power, to be able to push back, hold leaders accountable, and shift power in this moment. So this is where the civil resistance movement comes in. Next slide. And so just to say, what we're talking about with civil resistance is that, this is a way for ordinary people to harness power, wield power without the threat or use of violence. And it involves all the different tactics that have been responsible over the course of US history for abolishing slavery, gaining universal suffrage, achieving civil rights, worker rights, to protect, clean air and water. All of these tactics is what we're talking about with civil resistance that has such a long tradition in the US. Next slide, please. And so this role of pillars. So here's the thing, autocrats do not act alone. They have absolutely no power without the support of individuals within key organizations and institutions that provide them with the power that they need. And so you can think about these pillars. So think about civil servants and bureaucrats who execute policies, police and military who apply coercive power, unions, the huge, the economic power and worker power that they hold, businesses, that have significant financial power, religion that has moral power, organizational power, mobilizational power. So the idea here is that when power shifts within these pillars, when people stop going along with the status quo and start doing things that are maybe not expected of them, this is what these pillars, when they are no longer reliable and when the autocrat can't depend on them for sources of power, they lose their power. They lose their ability to control us. And so these pillars are not monolithic also. So they are made up of people with different interests, loyalties, and identities. And so you think about the faith pillar, that you have a leadership cadre, you have clergy, you have congregations, you have grassroots civic organizations. So the key here is you don't necessarily need to move the leadership in the middle. Sometimes the leaders will take action, will respond, but pressure from those outer rings, from clergy, from congregations, from civic organizations, can result in that pillar, wobbling, if you will. It can result in pressure being applied. And again, when those pillars when they stop providing their sources of power, the regimes cannot function. Next slide. And just to say, we think about like the power of the faith pillar, all of the assets that it has, the moral authority, the organizing power, the communications power, the mobilization potential, but also the religious pillar influences other pillars. And when you think about it, there are people of faith within all of these other pillars, within the civil service, within the police corps, within the military, unions, businesses. And just to say, these are not all the pillars. There are educational organizations, there are, cultural institutions. So the point is that people of faith and faith communities can exert leverage and influence over these other pillars through dialogue, through engagement, through acts of pressure. So this is, again, the kind of force multiplier that the faith pillar has, especially in this moment. Next slide. And so just to kind of put a finer point on like exactly what we're talking about here, about the power of non-cooperation. Actually, I can't see the full slide for some reason. And I probably should have that quote. But anyway, can you all read this? You all don't need me to read this quote, but basically, like, who is responsible for enforcing repressive laws and regulations, keeping trains running on time, preparing budget, repairing roads, building rockets, training the police and army, issuing postage stamps, even milking a cow? The autocrat doesn't do any of that. People provide these services to the ruler through a variety of organizations and institutions. And if people stop providing those skills, the ruler cannot rule. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of the power of non-cooperation. Next slide. So just maybe in the chat, share with the group how you can influence these pillars. What does that look like? How can you influence them individually, collectively? Like, what leverage are you using in this moment? And could you use to help shift these other pillars? So let's like put them out in the chat, see what ideas that folks come up with, because I know you all are often on this call are part of these other pillars as well, in addition to the faith pillar. Stop paying federal taxes, influencing the education pillar, the boycotts, not obeying, providing the full story to offer context, voluntary radical poverty, that's a powerful one. So lots of different ways. Yes, again, the op-eds, alternative education, lots of ways that you all can influence these other pillars. And we're going to talk about those now. We're now going to turn, before I turn it over to my colleague, to like, what are the superpowers that faith communities have in this moment? So next slide. So this is the thing. So faith organizations and communities and leaders have so much power. They have been on the forefront of so many of the most powerful movements for rights, freedoms, justice, democracy in this country and around the world. And let me cite a statistic. My old colleagues at the U.S. Institute of Peace found that religion has played a major role in about 58% of the major nonviolent resistance campaigns around the world. That's huge. So their leadership role has really, really mattered. So what are the superpowers? It's the moral power and the power of protest and persuasion, the speaking truth to power. It's the organizing and training. It's the provision of resources, mutual aid, sanctuary to mitigate repression, the leveraging of symbols, spiritual power, rituals, bridge building, non-cooperation. What has that looked like in practice? Next slide, please. So and there are so many different examples of each of these categories, but my goodness, that's the image of Bishop Buddy, her powerful plea to our leaders to have mercy during the inaugural prayer service, such a powerful moment of speaking truth to power. Hungry, evangelical, and other religious leaders have released the Advent statement that's based on the Barmen Declaration, denouncing the Nazification of German churches. They've used that to denounce Viktor Orban's centralization of power, incredibly potent statement. And then there's the whole category of organizing and training. Think about the role played by Black churches and meeting houses that provide critical organizing spaces, rallying points, training centers during the civil rights movement. East Germany, churches providing one of the only autonomous spaces for organizing against communist dictatorship. Next slide. These others, so provision of resources, mutual aid, sanctuary. In Chile, during, the movement challenging Pinochet, the Vicariate of Solidarity and the Catholic Church provided healthcare, legal services, employment opportunities. They supported a truth commission that documented human rights abuses. I flagged this powerful resource by the Cairo Center called A Matter of Survival that talks about rethinking church and how church transportation networks, spaces, sanctuary can be used to serve unmet needs during this time. The leveraging of symbols, rituals, power. Thinking about the role of Bishop Pham in San Diego in California, organizing with an interfaith clergy to provide pastoral witness at immigration courts and presence that has caused ICE agents to scatter when they confronted these, clergy and collars, and just the role of other kind of symbols, the songs in our protests and marches. Next slide. The bridge building, like so many examples. I'm thinking about the bridging of the Mormon Women for Ethical Government, all the creative tactics that they are using to bring people together across divides. Zambia, how the church bodies for Catholics, Protestants, Pentecostals used a broad front and organized a broad front to push back against then President Chiluba's attempt to overturn the Constitution and run for a third term. And then non-cooperation. And we have so many examples, and my colleague Adam Friedman is going to turn to this next. But everything from the American Jewish Congress and the Jewish Labor Committee organizing boycotts of German goods and protesting Nazi goods in the 1930s. The more recent faith-led boycott of Target by Nina Turner, Reverend Jamal Bryan. I'm thinking about the boycott of Velo Airlines, the premier deportation carrier of ICE deportation flights, and the role of so many denominations in essentially putting so much pressure on Velo Airlines that its West Coast operations have been shut down. So these are just a few of the examples of faith power in this moment. And I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Adam Friedman from Interfaith Alliance, who's going to talk through more on non-cooperation.
Thank you so much, Maria, not only for your really incredible words, your teachings, but also for being central to the fabric that holds this movement together. If we could go to the next slide. I'm going to speak here a bit about what we can do tangibly right? Up until this point, we've explored how faith communities anchor moral authority, and we can go back one slide, anchor moral authority in movements for justice. And now we're going to turn to what that looks like tangibly, right? In practice, the concrete ways ordinary people exercise nonviolent power. But first, I just want to name the sacred imperatives that every person confronting authoritarianism carries with us. And naturally, in this context, I want to invoke something from my tradition as a Reformed Jew, a teaching from Pirkei Avot I've been thinking a lot about recently. We are taught that we are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are we free to desist from it. And on your screen, you see what the work is ahead of us, right? The work is to protect people. The work is to defend civic institutions. The work is to peacefully disrupt and disobey. And the work is to build alternatives. Now, many of us are not only engaging in this sacred work through our big tent movement against authoritarianism, but through our churches, our synagogues, our mosques, our gurdwaras. These four imperatives are foundational to our sacred traditions. Next slide, please. And in addition to these sacred charges we carry, we also have an incredible time-tested chest of tools at our disposal. Right, we know that civil resistance operates through three main forms of people power, which have been, again, pressure tested through the ongoing global movement to defeat authoritarianism, and the movements for justice, which the deep well of resiliency inherent to faith-based organizing has been demonstrated time and time again. The first kind of mode I want to touch on is symbolic action. Marches, visuals, prayer services, artistic witness. These actions raise public awareness and call attention to injustice, demonstrating moral clarity and strengthening the rich tapestry of people of diverse faiths and beliefs aligned in our support for democracy. So I know there are a lot of examples listed here. Don't worry, you will get a list of these and many more after this evening. The second mode I'll touch on a bit more in the next slide as well is non-cooperation, the refusal to comply with unjust systems. This might mean strikes, boycotts, or faith institutions refusing to invest in or contract with entities that harm our communities. It is about withdrawing our consent and our resources from what violates our values. And this approach is especially central to the work ahead. Right? And the last kind of mode I want to talk about is alternative cooperation, building structures and systems that work for us. These can be mutual aid networks, freedom schools, community-run food and health programs. And at the core of this mode is something that models the just world we dream of and actualizing it today. Now, these three forms are interdependent, right? A movement is built upon all of them working in tandem, coordinating across geography and approach. Symbolic action activates people. Non-cooperation removes legitimacy from the authoritarian regime. And alternative cooperation lets us live into something better. Together, they form an ecosystem of nonviolent power that faith communities are uniquely positioned to cultivate. Next slide, please. Now, I want to briefly dive a bit more deeply into non-cooperation because this is one of the most powerful tools we have, right? And you can see this definition that we use on your screen here, tied back to the really central idea of pillars of support Maria just touched on. Now, a few things about non-cooperation. And I'm going to get a little spiritual here because non-cooperation isn't passive, right? It's deeply intentional, which I know everyone on this call knows something about. It's the moral, the financial, and institutional decision to say no. No to complicity, no to legitimizing hate, no to financing repression. And when enough individuals or institutions refuse to participate in injustice, the system that depends on their compliance begins to crack. Right? We know an authoritarian regime is not just one person. Authoritarians rely on the quiet compliance of everyday people, our labor, our money, our silence. But when we coordinate refusals, when we say no across congregations, across denominations, and across sectors or pillars, we demonstrate that power doesn't descend from our rulers. It rises from the consent of us, the consent of the governed. And that's why non-cooperation is both a strategy and a spiritual practice, right? It invites us to align our behavior with our deepest convictions, our tradition's most sacred teachings, reminding us that integrity itself can be a form of resistance. If we could go to the last slide for me, I just want to speak a bit on the levels in which non-cooperation happens. And I want to note that each level can build upon and reinforce the next. Right? This also means that your job isn't to end authoritarianism. I think this is something I encounter a lot, and I know sometimes I feel. Part of the intention of an authoritarian regime is to make us feel siloed, to make us feel hopeless, and an internalized feeling I know so many of us are grappling with in this moment is how we as individuals can address authoritarianism as this huge force. But the truth is that's not our job, right? Our job is just to start. At the individual level, that can look like a clergy member refusing to participate in a discriminatory event, a civil servant quietly declining to enforce an unjust directive. Those personal acts of conscience, of resistance are the foundation. At a collective level, we begin to organize those refusals, right? Coordinate, as I mentioned previously, across geography, across congregations, across traditions, and very tangibly that has looked like congregations declaring themselves sanctuaries, right, in more ways than one. Interfaith networks committing to host events that directly push back on this regime, or committing not to host hate-based speakers or folks that are spewing vitriol or supporting the regime, right? It can look like coalitions of religious institutions divesting their funds from corporations that profit from violence or are contracting actively with entities like ICE, right? That's financial non-cooperation, and it strikes directly at the economic pillars that sustain this injustice. And then I'll just mention at the mass level, these actions converge into organized campaigns like we saw this past weekend. Right from the Montgomery bus boycott to today's multi-faith economic boycotts, when each of us living our values becomes coordinated and coordinated courage becomes mass refusal, we know, we have seen both here and abroad that entire systems can shift. And this is the spiritual fabric of non-cooperation. Faith communities transforming our moral truths into collective power. By withdrawing our consent, we don't just resist what is wrong, we make space for what is right to take root. And in doing so, we create microcosms of the democracy for which we fight. So I'm so grateful now to introduce an incredible leader and colleague in our movement against authoritarianism and for multi-faith, multiracial democracy, Reverend Naomi Washington Leaphart, the Strategic Partnerships Director at Political Research Associates. Reverend Naomi.
Thank you so much, Adam, and all of the speakers who have preceded me. I'm going to carry right on in the spirit of things we can do, practical things we can do to demonstrate our non-compliance, our refusal to go along with authoritarian norms. I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about this notion of making political violence backfire. We know we are experiencing escalating political violence and repression in our communities. And let me just say that political violence and repression have always been part of the political fabric of the United States, right? And so that means that we know something about how political violence works. I put works in quotation marks. We know what perpetrators do to try to get us scared, isolated, and hand-wringing around what we can do in response to this. So the backfire model is a model that tries to enact costs to the perpetrators of political violence, right? We want to make their actions backfire. We want to make them counterproductive, right? We want to undermine them. That's what making political violence backfire means. So let's look at it. Let's go to the next slide. So remember I said, political violence is not new to the United States, right? And so that means that scholars and folks who study nonviolent movements, folks who study the successful defeat of authoritarian regimes have noticed that there's a pattern to political violence and repression, right? Perpetrators of political violence use these 5 tactics to repress us, to chill our response, to leave us scared and feeling powerless in the wake of political violence. First, they try to cover it up. So perpetrators of political violence simply deny it happened, right? They cover it up. They don't want the masses to know about the violent tactics, the repressive tactics that they're engaging. So they cover up the injustice. They might not be able to cover it up. If they can't cover it up, then they will devalue those who have been targeted or victimized by that violence. We've seen that, right? You know, somebody gets killed in an an act of police brutality, for example, right? Next thing we know, that person's character is being dragged, right, in public. What does this do? This turns down or lowers the public empathy or sympathy that we might have for that person who's been victimized, right? So they'll try to devalue and discredit the target, right? Another tactic of political repression and political violence is to simply spin that thing, reinterpret it in their favor, right? So they'll say, well, you know, this violence was inevitable, right? Or violence is the only way to repress. I mean, what we're seeing with the targeted attacks or threats to the kind of left infrastructure, right? That this crackdown on this criminalization of so-called woke politics is a necessary part of defending democracy, right? See how that spin works to convince everybody to just pack up and go home. We don't need to speak out against this repression because it's necessary, right? So they reinterpret what happened in their favor. Then they might, you know, if you can't stop folks' outrage, and there is an investigation or an official channel of investigation for that political violence, they'll try to hijack that, right? So, you know, oh, the DA's office is going to prosecute such and such and such, right? Well, they'll try to hijack that channel to give us a false sense of due process again, so it turns down the heat of our outrage and we pack up and go home, right? We've seen this happen. And then lastly, they'll try to intimidate and bribe us into supporting what they're doing or at least being silent about it, right? So using intimidation, even rewarding people for their silence, right? These are tried and true age-old tactics of perpetrators of political repression and violence, right? So this is their playbook. But how many know we have a playbook, right? So let's go to the next slide. This is kind of the backfire playbook, right? So they've got 5 tactics that they generally use. We've got 5 tactics we can use to undermine their political violence and make it backfire. What are those 5 tactics? 1, we reveal the injustice, right? So they're trying to cover it up. We are intentional about trying to expose it, right? This is what we mean when we have folk at mass mobilizations recording, right? Documenting what's going on so that it can be exposed and revealed, right? They try to devalue the targets of political repression and political violence. We redeem, we validate those targets. We say, no, this is a person from our community. This is our person, right? And so again, we discredit their attempts to drag the person's character and name through the mud, right? We reframe, right? So in the event that they try to spin and reinterpret what happened in their favor, we reframe that thing. We continue to drive home the narrative that what happened is unjust and it belies our values, right? We continue to reframe. We redirect people's energy away from official channels of investigation, which, you know, may not be trusted, may not be able to be trusted, right? And we mobilize people's support to strengthen the movement, right? So instead of saying to folks, there's an official investigation that we should trust it and go home, We say, no, 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 let's continue to build on this momentum, on this outrage, to continue to strengthen our movement infrastructure. We're not going to rely on official channels that may actually be tools of the opposition, right? And then lastly, we prepare our people to resist intimidation and bribes, right? And we don't take for granted that when presented with a bribe or an opportunity to remain safe in the wake of authoritarian repression, that people are going to be able to resist, right? So we practice resistance ahead of time, right? I want to end this backfire conversation with a case study of how people of faith and others made political repression backfire. Again, this is not new to us, right? Resistance movements down throughout history have used these tactics. Let's go to the next slide. This will be a familiar example to many of you, right? The Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965, right? The thing we ought to remember is that this particular part of the civil rights movement was catalyzed by, many acts, but a particular act of political violence and repression. There was a young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson who was killed doing voter registration work in the South, right? So that act of political violence was meant to chill the momentum of the civil rights movement. But here's what those astute and brilliant organizers did, right? On March 7th, 1965, hundreds of folks marched peacefully in Selma, right? But that was the culmination of many years of work. Groups like SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, had been doing lunch counter sit-ins, had been doing freedom rides to advocate for equal rights for Black folk in America. And they knew they would encounter violence, right? So in anticipation of that, they held workshops around the principles of nonviolent struggle. They simulated the harassment that they were going to face from segregationists, right? So they were building muscle memory, y'all, right? They were practicing first, right? Practicing responding to antagonization, practicing responding to violence with song, with prayer, with a particular kind of disciplined groundedness in their own values, right? They had folks to document, photographers, journalists, to be at those marches to capture evidence, because some people needed to see it before they believed it was happening, right? And so they astutely recognized that they were going to need people to document, right? Next slide. Now, the day of the march, right? They were being tear gassed, they were being beaten by state troopers, and those document folks, those photographers, exposed the violence, right? Because the narrative was, oh, these are unruly folks. These are outside agitators, whatever the narrative was that the authoritarian establishment tried to promote. The documentarians, the photographers, simply dispelled those narratives, right? The footage of what we now know as Bloody Sunday was shown on national TV. The pictures were placed in newspapers across the country. And people were able to see Black folks dignified in their Sunday best, being beaten and battered by white state troopers, right? Automatically flipped the script. And these photos also captured the diversity of the people who supported the movement, right? Because again, there was a narrative about who supported the civil rights that Black folk should have already been promised, right? So those photos helped to reframe the narrative that was spinning by the perpetrators of that political violence, right? And then, as the organizers predicted, exposing these abuses led to more outrage, right? You couldn't unsee it. You couldn't unring that bell. And more people joined the movement. That's the thing about backfire, right? The goal is to enact cost to the perpetrators of violence, but also to extend an invitation to more people to join the movement, right? It's an absorption strategy, because once you expose it and you get people outraged about it, you got to have something for them to defect to, right? And as we talked about those pillars, how we get people to defect from the pillars that are propping up authoritarianism, we've got to have a container. We've got to have a refuge place where people can come and get involved, right? We can redirect their shock, their awe, their outrage to moral and just principled action. Next slide. So again, so now there's more people involved, and you've got the leaders of the civil rights movement, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., calling on other religious leaders, come with us. Come with us. Maybe you weren't there at the beginning. Now we welcome you here. Join our peaceful nonviolent march for freedom. And so we know on March 9th, 1965, 2,000 folks marched across that Edmund Pettus Bridge and then knelt in prayer, thinking about what we said earlier about using the ritual and the symbols and the spiritual practices of our traditions, even as we protest, right? On March 21st, later in the month, they marched from Selma to Montgomery, and this time they had the protection of the Alabama National Guardsmen and FBI agents, right? These strategic efforts and actions are incredible examples of how a nonviolent movement can make violence backfire. And faith leaders led the way. People of faith led the way, right? So we stand on the shoulders of this long tradition. And at the end, you'll see some resources around how to make political violence backfire. You can go to endingpoliticalviolence.org, endpoliticalviolence.org, to learn more about this backfire strategy. Now I'm going to introduce our colleague, Reverend Dan Buttry, who's an author and a peace trainer. He's going to talk about a resisting authoritarianism Bible study. Reverend Dan, come on to the mic.
Thank you, Reverend Naomi. Thank you so much. Now we're going to be moving into some of the things that we can do following this time. So if we could get to the next slide, please, and then the next slide. As a Christian, we get anchored into our scriptures, and so we wanted to take a look at how we can do that so that we can connect to the roots that are thousands of years deep about resisting authoritarianism. This is not something new. This is something that goes to our faith roots. And so there's also efforts going on for those in other religious communities and the interfaith community. We're trying to get these together. And so if you're not a Christian, I would invite you to think about what might this look like within your community, and how might you be able to pull that together. And so we just recently wrote this Bible study. And if I could have the next slide. By the way, this Bible study is, the links are in the resources section that will be available not just during this conference, this training, but also later in many other sources. After the introductions, we basically got 7 sections, kind of an opening session, a closing session, but in between, we've got some key things that are part of moving us from our getting roots in our faith community and then moving us out into the places of struggle. In session 2, we look at one of the old stories, the story of Esther, but we use the tool spectrum of allies. Some of you know that, about how do we move people in our direction. We can't get all the people who are most set against us to become leaders in our movement. But if we can get active people to become more active, if we can get passive people to become active, if we can get neutral people to become supportive, even if they're passive, and so on, we can change that calculus that was mentioned earlier, that we're trying to change for what's happening in our society. And this happened in Esther, and we can take it apart in detail, and then we can apply it to our setting because we'll see how the tool works and be able to then use the tool in our own context. Session 3 looks at the story of Rizpah, a woman from the margins, a traumatized woman who engaged in nonviolent direct action and transformed history. An amazing story. Then the Sermon on the Mount, where we look at how can we make political violence backfire. Well, that's something that Jesus was teaching, and we can explore that and connect that to the kinds of things that Reverend Naomi was sharing. And then we talked about the different kinds of ways that our struggle can take shape. Holy non-cooperation, non-cooperation, symbolic action. We see that holy non-cooperation in Exodus 1 in Egypt, and the Hebrew midwives not cooperating with Pharaoh to kill the children, the babies as they were born, and then Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and then Daniel himself. Symbolic actions, we see these in the scriptures, and I particularly want to highlight Isaiah 20, where Isaiah for 3 years walked naked in his community. And so he's become, or should become, the patron saint of Portland, I think, right now, with all the naked Bible study, bike rides. And so I think it's really exciting for us to see our faith roots and to study them. And one of the things that we have in each one of these sessions is application. It's geared to action. We don't want to just be sitting in our sanctuaries or in our homes studying scriptures. We want this to be something that empowers us for action. And so each session has that kind of action to it. And so we want to encourage us to connect in all kinds of ways. And so there's resources and connections at the end of the study. And we also have it available in Spanish now. So things are moving quickly, and we hope to have similar guides in other religious communities and even an interfaith one. So thank you very much. And at this time, I'm going to pass it back to Jim Simpson.
Oh, sorry, I'll just hop in real quick to talk through our last couple of resources. I briefly, knowing that we're moving toward the end of our time here, want to lift up a really incredible resource that Protect Democracy put together in partnership with the Horizons Project and a number of exceptional faith organizations, many of which are sponsoring this call. There are 10 toolkits that are tangible, that are applicable to your community, that serve as ways, perhaps even a complement to the Bible study the Reverend just discussed, to continue our learning together in our communities, in our interfaith cohorts. And so I'll put that link in the chat here, and I really encourage everyone to take a look, because one of these 10 toolkits will speak to what you are looking for in this moment and how you see yourself engaging. And if we could go to the last slide, I also want to lift up a series of resources here, which similarly range to speak to the diversity of needs and ways in which people see themselves showing up. They're from a number of really great organizations, many of whom are on this call, and just represent a small subsection of all of the fantastic resources out there. But I'll just lift up the range that you can see on this slide. Again, speaking to the chat for just a moment, that all of these resources and more will be sent to you in the post-call email. I'll just name that in this slide, you can see the Cairo Center has amazing songs, a whole songbook that they put together ahead of some of the mass mobilizations this year. And if that speaks to you, that's a fantastic resource. And there are also the full-length versions of some of the content that you saw here tonight, really extensive trainings that'll get even more in depth. So however you see yourself continuing to do this learning, continuing to lean in, whether you are a congregational leader, clergy member, or somebody who is leading an organization, I encourage you to take some time after we send out that list of resources via email to the chat and think about how you can bring them home, what might resonate most with your community, and how you'd want to develop a cohort of faith leaders in your locality where you are to continue leaning in together. Thank you all so much. And with that, I'll pass it back to Jim Simpson.
Thank you. And maybe I could ask if Adam, we're going to move into just a short period of time of questions here. And so maybe if our presenters could all come off of, come back onto video, and we'll spotlight you all. There we go. Maria, get you on here as well. All right. Well, thank you so much. That was a lot. And you could see in the chat and in the Q&A section, there's a lot that people are thinking about this. And so we're going to speak a little bit later towards just after this question time about what are some ways that you can, as we are learning and having better understanding around this, about how you can take action in your own communities. But I want to highlight a couple of questions that I saw come in that I think are important. Maria, 3.5% rule. This is something that in conversations you and I have had is I think one of the things I found really valuable that I heard you talk about one time is it's less about the number and it's more about what underlies what it takes to mobilize that number of people. And so can you kind of speak a little bit more to the 3.5%? It's not just like once we pass a numeric threshold, authoritarianism will stop.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I give full credit to my colleague, Erica Chenoweth, who, using the data set underpinning our book together, Why Civil Resistance Works, ran the regression and found, that no regime has remained in power when 3.5% of the population has engaged in active protests. But as you say, that's a descriptive finding. It doesn't mean if you get to a certain threshold, you will be victorious. And the important thing is that, like, size matters because, like, people bring power, and the more people means more power, more leverage, more disruptive potential. And so what really matters is the sustainability. As you say, what matters is like being able to have the organizing infrastructure so that we can keep going, we can keep bringing people in, so that after No Kings there's a home for people, they're engaged, they're kind of engaging in different forms of leadership. So it's these elements of like sustained organization and momentum. So like being able to sustain, like, sequence tactics. So you start with the protest and then we're moving along to a consumer boycott. We may be involved in tax resistance. And so it's this kind of sequencing that builds kind of the leverage and power that ultimately is what is responsible for, transforming authoritarian regimes and democratic victories.
Yeah, thank you for that. Maybe, and I'm going a little bit out of order here, and we're not going to have time to get all the questions, but we will make sure to take them down and to help shape future content that we're able to offer. Reverend Naomi, if I can go to you, there was the question raised: how can folks practice resisting ahead of time? Trainings, other means. Like, I think this is it was inspired by some of your sharing. So how do folks practice this work?
Sure. Yeah. You know what, y'all? We can't overthink this, right? So, if I want to get good at basketball, I go to practice. I learn the fundamentals, right? I plan my moves ahead of time. I draw the play ahead of time, right? And so that means, we're talking about non-cooperation and non-compliance on the one hand, right? Where's no located in your body? Right? Practice saying no. I mean, maybe I'm just preaching to myself here, but I know that in my congregation, my childhood congregation, Christian congregation, right? I was sort of implicitly taught that no was not allowed. That disobedience, let me say it that way, that disobedience, that disrespecting authority was a breach of my faithfulness. And that lesson is in my body, right? That's why saying no, I feel something going on in my stomach, and all I got to do is send an email to say, no, I can't go, right? That comes from somewhere. So our religious communities can be spaces where we dig into that. Where did you first learn that no was not your right? Who sanctified that for you? Right? Right. So it's having knowing where no is located in your body, knowing what muscle needs to be stronger, right? It's having somebody pretend to yell in your face and noticing what that does to you, and then making a plan, right, for being able to take that. Yeah. So I really do mean practice, right? In safe ways, right? In trauma-informed ways, all of that. But what if, in my context, in Christian context, what if Sunday morning became a training ground? Not only for me to absorb the kind of theological strength and courage I will need to draw on, but to actually practice in the church fellowship hall how I'm going to resist, right? So we're creative, we can do it, and we don't need to overthink it. That's all I got to say.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to turn, Dan, there's been some questions which I remember from a conversation we had. You have just translated the Bible study into Spanish.
Yes.
And you also have, throughout your career, have done any amount of interfaith, multi-faith informed work. And I know that you are perhaps also interested in making an interfaith or other faith-specific study documents. Is that right?
Yes. In fact, I have been doing this kind of training all around the world. And a Muslim imam friend of mine in our interfaith group here in Detroit, he said he'd love to do the same thing in his mosque. And so we got together and I learned all the texts and stories from Islamic tradition that fit into these things. And we put together a great training for 4 days in his mosque. And so I know that we can reclaim the ways that some of our traditions have been used, to not disobey, as Reverend Naomi was said. And so when we have to stand up, and that's one of the things that's exciting about the scriptural plunge that can take place, is we can learn these things in a way that connect us to our spiritual roots, and that can give us the power for the long distance, and I think that's really critical. It also counters the Christian nationalism, which could be called religious fascism, that we need to also have as a part of our particular front, if you will, on this struggle.
Thank you. This is the last question. I know there's a ton of other questions that we are not going to get to tonight, but Adam, as always, deeply appreciated you walking us through the pillars of support framework. And I remember the first time I heard that, it was a really useful way and means for me to think about how do I go about taking agency in the ways that I have agency. And so I think that there are a number of different questions that have come in either in the chat or in the Q&A function about sort of like how, be it boycotts, be it withholding taxes, like how do we go about thinking about from and these are all the participants on the call, from their individual place of agency, their location, how should they think about doing an analysis and looking at how they can influence pillars within their local communities and beyond?
Yeah, such an important question. One thing I want to bring in there is a question I saw about how we take that first step and how we scale our impact. And so what I'd encourage everyone to do, if you're thinking about how to engage in strategic non-cooperation at the community level, is think about it with your community. Go to your house of worship, sit down with 5, 6 people and say, what are we all going to do together? Right? Because just in that moment, by bringing together a group of folks, you're engaging with not only your immediate circle, but every person that you're in relation with. I'll say that first and foremost. The second thing I'll say is there are a lot of little ways to engage in non-cooperation that I think help build up that muscle, right? I know for me, I live next to a Target. It's really hard for me to boycott Target just from a visceral standpoint. To Reverend Naomi's point about what we learn in our houses of worship, for me, as somebody who grew up with a rabbi mom who loved to go to Target and get clothes, that's part of my faith upbringing. And I was like, I'm going to do this. I'm not going to go to Target. That's what I'm taking on. And that was a big first step for me in just teaching my body how to non-cooperate, working up that muscle memory. So again, I'd say take a first step and do it with your friends, do it with your community.
Awesome. Well, thank you all again. We're coming close to the end of our time here. And before we end, we are going to hear from an incredible leader to round us out. But I just want to take a moment to offer my words of thanks. So thank you all for participating tonight. As we said at the beginning, this webinar is just the beginning. Some of you are already forming local cohorts, so thank you for taking that leadership. Others may not yet be connected. If that's you, we encourage you to start a new cohort or invite an existing interfaith or ecumenical group to take up the work of nonviolent civil resistance against authoritarianism. Our hope is that this webinar grounds us all in the urgent work of nonviolent civil resistance. And by year's end, we want everyone who's here today to be part of or helping to form a local cohort, because democracy will be defended through the organized action of communities like ours. As these cohorts are taking shape, we'll work with you to host in-person training of trainer sessions in your communities, which will equip you to lead and to train others. And together we can build the faith-rooted infrastructure our democracy needs. Our goal is broad, connected, and a resilient movement, grounded in faith, disciplined in nonviolence, and ready to stand for justice, truth, and democracy. So if you want help connecting locally, please reach out to us. Again, we will be following up with you with a lot of information. But if you are looking to get connected into starting or joining an existing local cohort, please reach out. We're committed to supporting cohorts nationwide by sharing resources, training opportunities, and ways to learn from one another as we move toward deeper collaboration and collective action. If you have specific needs, ideas, or resources you'd like to request, again, please don't hesitate to reach out. This is a network that we're building together. And so as you head out this evening, and I'm going to turn to Reverend Dr. Gould in a moment to close us out. But as you head out this evening and in the coming days and weeks, we wanted to ask you to think about someone who inspires you for exemplifying light and courage by actively working against darkness and hate, especially in the face of impossible odds. We need to hold on to the examples in our lives as we seek the courage to act ourselves. So thank you all today for your courage. Thank you for your faith and your willingness to act together. And I will now turn to Reverend Dr. Gould to offer a closing word and prayer.
Thank you. Thank you to all of my esteemed colleagues. I have the easiest job tonight. And thank you to all of you who showed up, who care about nonviolent resistance and are determined not to let authoritarians have the last word. Before we go, let us take a sacred pause to remember who we are, whose we are, and the holy work we've been called to do. We've heard a great deal of information tonight, some new, some familiar. Not all of us can do everything, but all people of faith and moral courage should be called to do something in this moment and the days ahead. Remember, we come from people who have always known how to resist, from the hush harbor of the enslaved to the lunch counters of the brave, from Selma to Ferguson. We have known what to do. Nonviolent resistance and non-cooperation is divine discipline. We are in a nation that has never wanted all of God's children to be free. And yet, by God's grace, freedom keeps breaking out and justice keeps showing up. Love keeps finding a way to crack the empire. By our faith, our shared, unyielding, freedom-loving, and freedom-fighting faith, we declare that no pharaoh, no empire, no authoritarian ruler has the final word over God's creation. So let us go to the Holy One of the many names. Holy One, grant us the courage to disrupt what must be broken, to defect from systems that deny your image in any of your children, to defend the sacred with holy conviction, and to delegitimize every empire that dares to sit in our way. Teach our hands the discipline of peace, and our hearts the power of righteous anger, and let our no be holy. When the forces of fear rise like Pharaoh's armies, remind us that you, with our help, are still parting seas. Give us the imagination to build a world where the table is long enough for every one of us, where love is not sentimental but strategic, and where worship is not an escape but fuel for the struggle. When our spirits grow weary, may we hear the ancestors whispering, "Keep going, you were made for this moment." So we go now, but we don't go alone. We go in covenant as comrades in community, in solidarity for our shared humanity. We go unbent, unbowed, unbought. We go to resist in love through organizing, to build in hope through mutual aid, to pray with our feet through mobilizing, and to rise together again. In the words of June Jordan and Alice Walker, we are indeed the ones we have been waiting for. We will resist not with violence, but with a love so fierce that it cannot be conquered. We will not cooperate with hate. We will not comply with oppression. We will not bend to tyranny nor bow to the idols of whiteness, patriarchy, or fear. Leave from this place, but never from the presence of the God of the many names that we love, who empowers us to get through this moment and beyond. Amen, Amen, and Ashe.
Amen. Thank you so much. And I hope you all have a good evening. Thank you.